What if I told you that a scientist, an atheist, all his life, found something in the Quran that completely changed his beliefs? A man who believed only in logic and numbers, who dismissed religion as myth, suddenly faced an undeniable mathematical truth, one so profound that he could no longer ignore it. Dr. Jonathan Reed was a man of science, a mathematician respected in his field. He spent decades proving theories and unraveling complex equations. To him, the world was nothing more than patterns, formulas, and probabilities. Everything could be measured, tested, and explained. And yet, he never expected that a simple conversation over coffee would lead him to question everything he once believed. One afternoon at the university lounge, Dr. Reed sat across from his colleague Dr. Ahmed, a physicist and a devout Muslim. Their discussions often turned philosophical, with Jonathan enjoying every chance to challenge religious beliefs. This time, however, Ahmed didn't defend his faith with scripture or personal testimony. Instead, he leaned forward and said, "Jonathan, you believe that mathematics is the universal truth, don't you?" Jonathan smirked, nodding. "Of course. Numbers don't lie." Ahmed's expression was calm, almost amused. "Then why don't you analyze the Quran?" Jonathan scoffed. "You want me to analyze a religious text with mathematics? What exactly am I supposed to find? That's for you to discover," Ahmed replied, pushing a small Quran across the table. "If you believe truth lies in numbers, test it yourself." Jonathan hesitated. Religion had never interested him, except to disprove it. But Ahmed's confidence made him curious. Without much thought, he took the book, promising himself that this would be nothing more than an intellectual exercise. That night, he opened the Quran, not to seek spirituality, not to find God, but simply to challenge a claim. He expected poetic verses, historical references, maybe even contradictions. What he did not expect was to find numbers, patterns, sequences, repeating in ways that defied randomness. Numbers don't lie. As he scribbled calculations in his notebook, something unusual began to emerge. A system, a structure, a code hidden beneath the words. At first, he dismissed it as coincidence. But as he analyzed further, a single number kept appearing, over and over again, 19. It was a detail too precise to ignore. Unbeknownst to him, this was only the beginning of a journey that would shake the very foundation of his beliefs. The impossible discovery, 450 words. Dr. Reed had spent his life searching for patterns in the universe. From the spiral arrangement of galaxies to the Fibonacci sequence in nature, he knew that mathematics was woven into the very fabric of reality. But he never imagined he would find such precision in an ancient religious text. Yet, as he analyzed the Quran, one number stood out more than any other: 19. At first it seemed like an odd coincidence. But the more he looked, the more undeniable it became. The opening verse of the Quran, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, contained 19 letters, the total number of chapters in the Quran, a multiple of 19. The word Allah appeared in frequencies that aligned perfectly with 19. Was this intentional, or just a statistical anomaly? Dr. Reed sat back in his chair staring at his notes. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. As a scientist, he had always trusted numbers. But this was beyond logic. The Quran had been compiled over 1400 years ago, preserved without alteration. How could an uneducated man from the 7th century create a book with a mathematical system so advanced that it could only be discovered with modern computational analysis? He recalculated, again and again. The results remained the same. For the first time in his life, he was faced with something he couldn't explain away. Desperate for validation, he expanded his research. He read studies on the mathematical structure of the Quran and found that scholars had been studying this for decades. Some dismissed it as chance, but others saw it as undeniable evidence of a divine origin. Was this merely an elaborate coincidence, or was the book truly encoded with a system beyond human capability? Dr. Reed couldn't ignore the findings, but he wasn't ready to accept their implications. He needed external confirmation. When he shared his discoveries with fellow scientists, they laughed. "You're looking for meaning where there is none," they said. "This is just pattern recognition, like seeing shapes in clouds," but none of them could disprove it. They dismissed it, but they could not refute it. The evidence remained. Dr. Reed spent months trying to find an alternative explanation. But no matter how he approached it, the numbers remained consistent. The Quran wasn't just a religious book, it was a mathematical enigma. Finally, he could no longer deny it. "This is beyond human capability," he whispered to himself. And for the first time in his life, Jonathan Reed, the man who had spent decades rejecting faith, felt the walls of his skepticism begin to crumble. Dr. Reed had spent his entire life trusting logic, reason, and numbers. Yet, here he was, staring at a discovery that defied all rational explanation. His fingers hovered over his notebook, covered in calculations, patterns, and equations that pointed to an undeniable truth. The Quran contained a mathematical structure beyond human comprehension. His mind fought against the conclusion forming within him. There has to be another explanation, he thought. A coincidence, a mistake in my calculations, some hidden manipulation of data. But no matter how many times he rechecked the numbers, they were always the same. He buried himself in research, cross-referencing historical records. The Quran had remained unchanged since its revelation. Unlike other texts that had undergone revisions and alterations, this book had been meticulously preserved, letter for letter, word for word. If the mathematical patterns were deliberate, then they had been present from the very beginning. That was what terrified him the most. Could an illiterate man in 7th century Arabia really have encoded such a structure into a religious text? And if he didn't, then who did? Doubt crept into his thoughts. He had spent years arguing against religion, believing that faith was simply an emotional response to the unknown. But now the evidence before him was forcing him to question his own beliefs. One night, exhausted from days of non-stop research, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. His world, once so neatly defined by logic and equations, was beginning to unravel. "Am I wrong?" he whispered to himself. For the first time in his life, the scientist who prided himself on certainty was filled with doubts. Doubt had taken root in Dr. Reed's mind, but he wasn't ready to accept the implications just yet. He needed answers, logical, rational, scientific answers. If what he had found was true, then it had to be explainable. Determined to understand what he was dealing with, he expanded his research. He read academic papers, consulted mathematicians, and even looked into historical theories regarding Quranic numerology. But no one could provide a solid explanation for the patterns he had found. The deeper he went, the more questions arose. The Quran's structure wasn't just mathematically significant, it was intricately layered. The placement of words, verses, and chapters followed a system that modern computational analysis could barely begin to decipher. He found other scientific discoveries within the Quran that startled him. Mentions of embryology, oceanic barriers, and even references to the expanding universe, concepts that had only been proven in recent centuries. How? How could this knowledge exist in a book from the 7th century? The more he read, the more he realized that the Quran was filled with insights that predated scientific discoveries by over 1,000 years. He had spent his entire life believing that science and religion were opposing forces, but now, he began to wonder, what if they were meant to work together? He was no longer searching for flaws, he was searching for truth, but the truth was dangerous. He knew that questioning his atheism would invite criticism from his peers. He knew that acknowledging the possibility of divine revelation would mean tearing down the very foundation of his beliefs. And yet, he couldn't turn away from the evidence. If I claim to follow the truth, he thought, then I must follow it wherever it leads me, even if it leads me to God. Dr. Jonathan Reed had spent his life debating religious believers, dismantling their arguments with cold, hard logic. Yet now he found himself trapped in the very conflict he had mocked for years. His entire worldview was built on the foundation that science held all the answers, that human intellect was the ultimate force of discovery. But what he had uncovered in the Quran didn't just challenge that belief, it shattered it. For weeks he wrestled with his thoughts. Every time doubt crept in, he went back to his research, searching desperately for an alternative explanation. Maybe I'm reading too much into this. Maybe the patterns are a coincidence. But every attempt to dismiss it only led him back to the same conclusion. This is beyond human capability. He thought about his career, his reputation. If he accepted this truth, what would it mean for everything he had built? What would his colleagues say? His students? His family? Would they call him a fool? A man who abandoned science for superstition? He wanted to let it go, to walk away and forget about it. But he couldn't. The numbers were still there. The discoveries were still there. the truth was still there. One evening, as he sat alone in his dimly lit office, he looked out the window at the vast night sky. He had always admired the universe, the elegance of its design, the precision of its laws, and suddenly for the first time he wondered, if the universe follows such perfect order, if mathematics can explain everything, then who created the mathematics? A chill ran down his spine, because for the first time in his life, he had no answer. Dr. Reed had always believed that science would one day explain everything, that every mystery, every unknown was simply waiting to be unraveled by human intellect. But what if science itself was pointing to something greater? He turned his attention away from the numerical patterns and began studying the Quran's scientific insights. He had always dismissed religious texts as outdated, filled with vague poetry and outdated knowledge. But what he found stunned him: the development of the human embryo described in detail 1,000 years before modern embryology. The expansion of the universe hinted at centuries before Edwin Hubble's discovery. The barriers between salt and fresh water described in a time when no one could have observed them. Every verse, every claim, seemed to align with modern scientific discoveries in ways he couldn't explain. He tried to find errors, inconsistencies, something that would disprove these findings. But there were none, and that terrified him. Because if this knowledge existed long before human civilization had the tools to discover it, then there was only one possible explanation: it had been revealed. He felt his heart racing. He wasn't just facing numbers anymore. He was facing something much bigger. It was no longer just an intellectual challenge. It was a question of truth, and deep down, he knew that truth could no longer be ignored. Dr. Jonathan Reed had always been confident in his arguments. Whenever religion was brought up in academic discussions, he would dismantle it with ease. But now, he found himself on the other side of the debate. He couldn't keep his findings to himself. He needed validation. He needed someone to either confirm or disprove what he had discovered. So cautiously he approached his colleagues. One afternoon during a faculty meeting, he casually brought up the concept of mathematical structures in ancient texts. At first, his peers humored him, intrigued by the theoretical discussion. But when he revealed that he was specifically talking about the Quran, their expressions changed. "You're joking, right?" one of them said, laughing. "Numbers can be manipulated to mean anything," another scoffed. "It's just selective data interpretation." He tried to explain this wasn't just cherry-picked data. The patterns were systematic, undeniable. The probability of such alignments being random was nearly impossible. But the more he defended the findings, the more resistance he faced. "You've been reading too much into this, Jonathan," an older professor said, shaking his head. "You're a scientist. Stick to real research." No one wanted to listen. Worse, some began to look at him differently. Conversations became shorter. Invitations to research collaborations suddenly disappeared. He could feel the subtle shift, the quiet rejection from the academic circle he had belonged to for years. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be on the outside. Doubt crept in again. Was he really losing his credibility over this? "Maybe I should stop," he thought. "Maybe I should forget about all of this and move on." But in the silence of his own mind he already knew he couldn't. Because the truth wasn't in the opinions of others. It was in the numbers, the science, the patterns that refused to be ignored. And deep down he knew what he had to do next. It was late. The campus was empty, and the only sound in Dr. Reed's office was the steady hum of his computer. He had spent months wrestling with the evidence, searching for flaws, questioning everything he had ever believed. But now, the questions had stopped. There were no more arguments left to make, no more theories to test. There was only one truth. He opened the Quran once more, this time not as a skeptic, not as a scientist searching for errors, but as a man seeking clarity. His fingers traced over the Arabic script, unfamiliar yet strangely comforting. He turned to a verse he had come across before, one that had lingered in his mind for weeks. "We will show them our signs in the horizons and within themselves until it becomes clear to them that this is the truth." Quran 41:53. He exhaled. He had spent his life chasing truth, convinced that science alone held all the answers. But now he saw it clearly. Science had only led him to the doorstep of something greater. His entire life, he had demanded proof. Now he had it, and in that moment, he finally let go. With a deep breath, he whispered words he never thought he would say: "There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger." The journey that had started with skepticism had led him to the ultimate realization. He was no longer searching, he had found the truth. The moment Dr. Jonathan Reed uttered the words of the Shahada, a strange sense of peace washed over him. It wasn't an emotional outburst. It wasn't the euphoria of a spontaneous decision. It was clarity. For the first time in his life, he felt as though the questions that had haunted him for years had finally been answered. But peace did not mean ease. The days that followed were filled with an eerie silence. The world around him hadn't changed, but he had. He knew he had to tell his colleagues, his friends, his family. When he finally did, the reactions were worse than he had expected. "You converted to Islam?" His closest friend at the university looked at him in disbelief. "Jonathan, you're a scientist. How can you believe in religion?" The disappointment in their eyes was unmistakable. Some tried to reason with him, to convince him he had fallen for a fallacy. Others stopped speaking to him altogether. The same academic community that once respected him now regarded him with suspicion. But the hardest conversation was with his parents. His father, a retired physicist, simply stared at him for what felt like an eternity before shaking his head. "You've lost your mind," he muttered, walking away. His mother had tears in her eyes. "But we raised you to think rationally, to never fall into blind faith." "I haven't," he assured her. "This isn't blind faith. This is truth." Yet despite the pushback, despite the whispers in the halls of the university, despite the loneliness that followed, he had no regrets. Because for the first time he wasn't searching anymore. Sitting alone in his office one evening, Dr. Reed reflected on the journey that had brought him here. A year ago he would have laughed at the idea of ever believing in God. Now he couldn't imagine how he had ever denied it. Mathematics had been his language, his way of making sense of the universe. And in the end, it was numbers that had led him to faith. He thought about the precision of the Quran's numerical structure, the scientific revelations within its pages, the undeniable patterns that had forced him to question everything he once believed. And he thought about the verse that had echoed in his mind since the moment he first read it: "We will show them our signs in the horizons and within themselves until it becomes clear to them that this is the truth." Quran 41:53. He had spent his life demanding proof. God had given it to him. Looking out the window at the vast night sky, he felt a sense of gratitude. "I was never meant to reject science," he thought. "I was meant to follow it to the truth." With that, he turned off his desk lamp, gathered his things and walked out. His journey wasn't over. It had just begun.